Water is our most important nutrient, but it also has impacts in the field beyond just having too little or too much.
Again, back to a plant, which one's going to kill it first, lack of water or lack of air? The plants are basically dying because the roots can't breathe.
Today on episode 436 of the Working Cows podcast, we're going to talk to Eric Fuchs and Brian Dougherty of Understanding Ag about managing water quality in our fields and under our fields, as well as downstream from our fields.
And I worked about 10 years in the industry at a company called Missouri Rural Water Association and worked in source water protection. And the problems aren't getting better. They're getting much, much worse. And the frustrating part about that is they're so easily fixed. Just some cover crops, some better infiltration. Not only are we having quantity problems like out in the Ogallala and some of the places in New Mexico and California, but then we're also having quality issues. Nitrates in drinking water. Agriculture may be a big part of creating those issues, but no doubt they are the ones and can be the ones to fix them and fix them quick.
All that and more on this episode of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast. Very excited to be joined once again by Eric Fuchs and Brian Dougherty, both of them members of the team over at Understanding Ag. And we're going to talk to them about the water cycle today, one of the 4 ecosystem processes that we are seeking to influence through the 6 principles of soil health and the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. And we're going to talk about the ins and outs of the water cycle under our operations in the soil and in the water table and all of those things, but then also about the challenges facing agriculture as it relates to the way that our management impacts the water cycle or the water quality of those downstream from us, our city neighbors and cousins. And so we'll have that conversation with Brian and Eric right after a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. Brian, Eric, thanks for joining me again on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us, Clay.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, and we're talking today about water quality and, obviously one of the 4 ecosystem processes that we're really trying to pay attention to is that water cycle and how do we manage that well. And there's a lot that goes into this conversation, but let's just start with some of the issues facing us from a water cycle perspective in agriculture. And then, we'll just start there. What are some of the issues facing us from the water cycle perspective?
Well, Clay, as you know, we have so much runoff and not enough infiltration. And in a nutshell, that's driving all the system. If it's a water quantity issue or a water quality issue, it all has the same problem. It's just a lack of ability to take water in and keep it once it's there. So, we're seeing a lot of these crazy weather systems across the country with lots of rain, a lot of fast rain, but really with a correct working water cycle and soil that can infiltrate, we could take in and keep a vast amount of that rain. Now, I know when we get 8-10 inches of rain, but if we could take in 4 or 5 inches instead of it all going off, just think how that would change things.
Yeah, it's not how much you get, it's how much you keep, right? And I think that, I remember early on in the Journey of the Working Cows podcast talking to Gabe Brown, and he talked about their ability to infiltrate water there at Brown's Ranch in Bismarck. And, I asked him, I said, well, if you can infiltrate that much water in an hour, what is a flood? You don't even, obviously things happen and Mother Nature can throw more at us than we can take sometimes, but that's still being able to take in water. That's the name of the game, really, being able to get it in the ground and hold on to it. That's really what it's all about in agriculture. Talk to me a little bit, Brian, about some of what water makes happen under the ground. What is it that water is enabling underground for us?
Sure. Yeah. So obviously we want to get our water to infiltrate, but once that happens, then there's a whole lot going on under the surface. So some of your, kind of the old school thinking when it comes to like nutrient uptake was a lot of that was actually driven by water. And that's true. There are some nutrients that, potassium is a classic example. If you want to get good uptake, that's driven primarily by water. So it is involved with nutrient uptake. It's involved with, providing a habitat for your microbes to live in. So we say that the soil is basically like a subaquatic ecosystem. So the microbes are actually living in those little water films that are on our soil aggregates or on your sand, silt, clay particles. And so, water is life. Without water in the soil, we're not going to have good biological activity. It also provides a buffering effect from like temperature swings. So that's another really important thing that the water is doing in the soil, because water, it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water compared to air, for example. And so, if you've got water in the soil, it's going to warm up slower, it's going to cool down slower. And so that can be a good or a bad thing depending on your situation. But those would just be some of the more like the physical things that are happening in the soil with water.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's similar to life, right? You can go many days without food. You can go fewer days without water, right? And if we don't have water, that's the real limiting factor for us. And so what you're saying is the underground livestock are the same way. They need water first, and then they are able to make use of all that other available nutrients.
Exactly. Yeah. And kind of on the flip side of that, if we don't have enough pore space, to be able to take that water in and get it infiltrated deep into the profile, we can have that, all of our pore space near the surface fill up with water, and then we don't have any room for air. So again, back to a plant, which one's going to kill it first, lack of water or lack of air? It's actually when soils become waterlogged, the plants are basically dying because the roots can't breathe. So there's all kinds of complexity with what's going on under the soil.
Right. What is it? You can live months without food or weeks without food, days without water, and minutes without air. So it is exactly the same for plants. Yep. Is that what you're telling me?
Exactly.
Yep. Okay. So let's talk then about some of the ways that we go about fixing that broken water cycle. What are some of the keys to getting the water to infiltrate? That seems to be the issue, right? Floods are the issue of water not infiltrating, it's running off. One of the classic examples is the difference between, is it the Minnesota and the Mississippi River? Have you ever seen that picture where you can see where they come together? I think it's those two rivers, and the Minnesota River comes from a lot of farm country. No offense, but comes from a lot of farm country, and it's brown. The Mississippi River comes from a lot of rangeland and forests, and it's not brown. So that's runoff taking that topsoil along with it. So what do we need to do, Eric, to go about getting some of that infiltration and fixing that so we can get the infiltration?
It's really twofold, and the first thing is, like you said, let's have a physical cover, or something. It doesn't take much of a plant just to stop that actual physical erosion or physical runoff coming from a rain or a lot of rain running. But then we're always looking to build an aggregate, and so an aggregate is the what builds aggregates? Well, we need biology. How are we going to get biology? Well, we need a living root. We need diversity. We need the principles. And I know you've heard this over and over on the Working Cows podcast, but it really does. It is the basics of all the structure that starts down the road to healing things on the planet. So, we get diversity in there, we get cover in there, we get that living root in there as long as we can, we build those aggregates, and then we keep rain. It's really that simple. We keep it, we get it in, and we keep it, and that's where the root of the problem is solved.
Brian, let's talk about the actual process of developing aggregates. What are the steps in that process? How do we go from water, air, sunlight, energy, all of these things to actually we have aggregated soil after some process? What is that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it all starts with the plant. So we have photosynthesis, which is just simply the plant taking CO2 from the atmosphere and combining with water, and it's making sugars or carbon. So a portion of that carbon is actually pumped out through the root system of the plant, and what we would call root exudates. And so that's one of the factors that's involved with creating soil aggregates. So an aggregate, for listeners who aren't familiar, we're just talking about little clumps of soil that are glued together by biological activity. So the second part of that is that biological activity. So bacteria and protozoa and fungi, all these organisms in the soil that are just constantly doing their thing. They're living, they're dying, they're eating each other. And that whole process creates, I just, call it simply dead microbe goo. So it's kind of sticky stuff that will stick to your clay particles. And so that's where some of your organic matter comes from, and some of that glue that helps hold those aggregates together. And then your mycorrhizal fungi in particular play a huge role here because they make a substance called glomalin along with other compounds, and that's just a sticky protein. So your bacteria, they make the tiny, tiny little what we call microaggregates that you can barely see, and then the fungi stitch all of those together into what we call macroaggregates, using those sticky proteins and biological glue. So that's basically the whole process. It creates a network of, pore space and voids in the soil, and it creates this whole environment that plants need to survive and thrive, because inside that aggregate, the plant can have everything it needs. So you can have areas of, high pH and low pH within centimeters of each other in the soil. And the same thing, if you want to get into redox chemistry, that gets really complicated, but you can have high and low redox potential just right within, centimeters to millimeters in the soil. So that root can go through that aggregate and have everything it needs. It's got water, it's got air, it's got different conditions for nutrient availability. And so that's basically how aggregates form and how that, works in synchrony with the plants to make the whole system work.
Yeah, and this is where we start to talk about compounding and cascading effects, right? Because if you don't have well aggregated soils, then the roots aren't able to push through that compaction. And then because the roots can't push through that compaction, you don't have the mycorrhizal fungi, you don't have the ability to make the soil glues, to make the aggregates, to create the pore space, to get in the water and the air, right? I mean, it's all this stuff is connected. And that's why the 634 is the powerful tool that it is, where you start to pay attention to these things and you start to see the three rules of adaptive stewardship, and the compounding and cascading effects start to make a lot of sense, right?
And Clay, what's interesting about that's why you see really no difference in low rainfall areas to high rainfall areas. We're in a 45, and last year we had 70-inch rainfall environment, and we are 2 weeks from a drought. And so it's really funny. It is definitely not about how much it's how it's taken in the soil, how it's kept, how it's stored. Because so rainfall, the amount of now. I'm sure Fernando and people like that would look at us and say it's easy to say when you get over 3 inches, but really is, we are 2 weeks, we can have a 10-inch rain and we're 2 weeks from a drought because we move all that rain off.
Yeah, but even in Fernando Falamir's case, he is continuing to increase diversity and all these things in that exceptionally difficult environment, And so, I mean, he's moving the needle in the right direction. And when the rain comes, you'll be able to increase the stocking rate sooner than the neighbors who are going to have to take longer to get that water into the soil profile. Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, the Soil Health Academy. We've been fortunate to feature some of the world's leading regenerative ag and adaptive grazing experts on our show. And many of those experts are farmer-rancher instructors for the nonprofit Soil Health Academy. This year, you'll have several opportunities to experience and profit from attending one of their remarkable on-farm schools and workshops. Whether you're interested in learning more about diversifying corn and bean rotations to increase profitability, merging multi-species and marketing, grazing on the high plains and in northern environments, regenerative farming and ranching, or enhancing profits and production in your beef or dairy operation, the Soil Health Academy has a school for you. One of the best investments you can make is in yourself. So visit www.soilhealthacademy.org to learn more and register. Financial assistance scholarships are available. And I think also, again, understanding ag, we're going to talk shovel test. What are some of the things we should be looking for to see, hey, we're moving in the right direction, we're getting some aggregation here, we're starting to create some space for water and air?
That shovel test is probably the best test there is. You could do some infiltration rings, but, to dig that shovel in and especially be able to watch and see how far that aggregation is going down. So the goal is like you've seen some of the pictures on Gabe's, is how far can we take that aggregation down? Most of us are lucky if we've got a couple inches with it, especially with a lot of cool season dominant pastures. But as we get some of these natives, we can go 1, 2, 3 foot down. And so you can see, I don't think we even have scratched the surface of what the water holding capacity is and how drought resilient we can be. I mean, you just absolutely even out those peaks and valleys by being able to move those aggregates down and then actually be able to have the water follow it down. So the shovel test is, to me personally, is the best thing you can do to see where you're, each year, look at it each place and see how you're doing.
Yeah. And Brian, what are some of the physical characteristics that we're looking for? What are some of the signs, maybe, even like I'm thinking of, and they're add to this, please, but I'm thinking of nodulation on the roots and some of those things. What are some things we should be looking for below the soil surface when we're digging that shovel test?
Yeah, if you've never done a shovel test before, it can be a little intimidating because you're not really sure what you're looking at or what you're looking for. But a simple analogy that we always use is you want your soil to look like chocolate cake or cottage cheese type look to it. You want to see lots of crumb structure. So that's the first thing I look for when I stick the shovel in. And as Eric said, how deep does that go? So that's an important one. We're also looking at color. So a lot of soils, you'll see a pretty distinct layer, where your organic matter drops off pretty sharp. So you'll have maybe 2 or 3 inches of darker soil on the surface, and then it turns colors. So look for where that layer is, how deep it is, and then watch that over time. Can you move that layer deeper? Can you get more organic matter in that topsoil? So that's another important one. Another one I really like to look at is the roots of the plants. So, when you dig that up, always dig up some roots and kind of shake the soil off and see, is that soil sticking to your roots? And if it is, that's a good sign. That tells us that process is working, where those plants are pumping carbon out through the root system. We want to see lots of fine root hairs. So your root should almost look fuzzy. That's a really good sign if you see that, because that tells us the process is working well. So those would be the big ones I would look for. And then we're always looking for compacted layers. So, either you can actually feel it with your shovel, or you can stick a rod in the ground and find out where that compaction layer is, and are the roots going through it. So look at your root structure, and if you see your roots go down and they go sideways, that's a dead giveaway. They've hit a compaction layer that they can't get through. And so we need to implement the principles to address those types of challenges. But those are the physical things I'm looking for with the shovel test.
Yeah. And I think that, I will say that the biggest impact that the Soil Health Academy had on me was just that observation, those observational skills. Like, you go to the Soil Health Academy and you will learn. They will not let you leave until you have learned at least some observational skills on how to look at those things, how to do those things, how to do the shovel test, how to use the refractometer, how to use the infiltration ring. And they will do, I think they did a great job of picking spots where they could go and say, okay, here's a good, or here's something that's at least better than something right across the fence. And you can see the difference in the infiltration ring and the shovel test and all those things. So I think that's a really, really strong argument for why people should be looking for an opportunity to get to the Soil Health Academy sooner rather than later, right?
I'm a big fan of SHA, yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a great way. If you're not really sure how, what should your field look like, go find, go to the edge of the field, in a ditch, a buffer strip, the edge of the woods, whatever, find some undisturbed area and stick the shovel in there, and then compare that to your field and see how different are they? Or, over time, what we're trying to do is to get the soil in your field to look like the soil that hasn't been disturbed. And it is achievable. It just takes time to get there.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
I was just saying the observation skills, and I know you run into it, Clay, when we move livestock. If we would just take 10 more minutes just to look and notice of what they eat and how they're moving across the field, and even folks that do a lot of adaptive grazing, we just get in a hurry, we run out there and move them and we leave. How many people get off the tractor and dig around and look how things are looking? It's just, it doesn't take much time, but it does take time. And to be able to get in the habit of actually looking at your surroundings, looking what's out in front of you, it is amazing what you'll see and how it changes your overall picture of the way things are and the way they can be.
What are some examples of, things that have stuck out to you as far as examples of really good, deep aggregated soils? Can you just give us a sense of how good it can be? I know basically as far as I've understood it in talking to a lot of different people in this sector of the agriculture industry, they would all say we're just at the tip of the iceberg. You've alluded to it here already, that we don't know really we don't really understand everything that's going on under the soil. First of all, we understand maybe the top 10% of what's happening, but also we don't know how good it can get. Like it just continues to improve and better. But what are some of the more remarkable examples you've seen as far as depth of soil aggregation?
Normally, see if Brian says, normally it's when you go over in the road ditch and see the difference with no management. But I don't know that I've seen anything, when you see some of the natives and you can find some pastures, even some poorly grazed natives sometimes out in Kansas and different places, it is amazing how deep that aggregation is going to go. And it's going to go as deep as those roots, especially when you start getting adaptive grazing and correct grazing management, it is going to go as deep as those roots will go. So that's probably when I get it on some of these places where a lot of the natives haven't been played out and still or doe, that's where I've probably seen the best. And again, if you can go over in the road ditches and stuff like that, it's nothing to see, 8, 10, 12 inches of really good aggregated soil. Once you see it, you just can't unsee it. It's crazy. You'll dig out in the field and you're like, oh, well, this doesn't look too bad. And then you'll go over to the edge of the ditch or something, and it will just blow your mind how the unmanaged the unmanaged stuff is just so much better. So a little bit of a long no answer there, but yeah, I think you know what I mean. Yeah.
Well, it's better than saying it depends.
But I'll just have to say one thing for Brian. I don't think we have a clue how much we have degraded this land and how much we can go the other direction. I mean, there's, as deep as those natives or as deep as those plants are going to go, theoretically, you can aggregate all the way down that far. So I don't think we have a clue how far we can do.
Yeah, I was just going to say our best indicator for that, again, is that infiltration test. That's the one that really opens people's eyes. A couple of years ago, we were doing a Soil Health Academy up in Minnesota, and I know I pounded the ring in and just started adding water, and we were timing it, and you could just see people's jaws kind of hitting the ground. Like, it took 6 inches of water in like 4 minutes. And people had, I'm sure most people had just never seen that before, and you don't even think it's possible until you actually see it, because according to the textbook, that's not possible. But you're standing right there watching it happen. So that's the one that really opens people's eyes.
Sure. Yeah. And that's, again, poor space. There's room for that water to go down in there, and it just goes, right? Yeah, so I guess take a little bit of a turn here and talk a little bit about how this impacts our non-agricultural neighbors and some of the responsibility that we have as those who do manage the majority of the landscape, really North American for sure. The majority of the North American landscape is managed by agriculturalists with small little dots in every state that are not generally, but that's the way most of these states look. And so we have a responsibility because of that, what we've been entrusted with, to manage it in a way that is positive for our neighbors. Is that how you look at it?
Absolutely. From the aspect of a whole, agriculture manages the vast amount of the land around, and so what we do to protect those water resources that, I've got a background in water and wastewater, actually drinking water and wastewater, but everything becomes somebody's drinking water one time or another. So what we're doing on our land, while it may be 1,000 miles away, what leaves our land for the most part, from a negative standpoint, is going to affect somebody. And like you said, our city cousins are going to be affected by that through their problems or issues with drinking water.
Yeah. How is that going currently?
Boy, you said you would kick the hornet's nest, didn't you? Well, from my experience, and I worked about 10 years in the industry at a company called Missouri Rural Water Association, and worked in source water protection, and the problems aren't getting better. They're getting much, much worse. And the frustrating part about that is they're so easily fixed. Like we said, just some cover crops, some better infiltration, keeping, I always joke, do whatever you want on your land, but as soon as it leaves it, it becomes somebody else's problem. And a lot of people are paying for it. So not only we're having quantity problems like out in the Ogallala and some of the places in New Mexico and California, but then we're also having quality issues. Nitrates in drinking water. Iowa, unfortunately, is very well known in the country for what it contributes to the Gulf of Mexico and things like that. So at our current rate, unfortunately, we're not getting better. But I can tell you the solutions are out there, and they're very easily implemented from a soil health standpoint to fix those problems. Agriculture may be a big part of creating those issues, but no doubt they are the ones and can be the ones to fix them, and fix them quick.
Yeah, Brian, what's your perspective on this issue of water quality for non-agricultural people and how they're impacted by it?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Eric said. We hear a lot about nitrate in the news, polluted rivers, high nitrate drinking water wells, and that's a huge issue. But still, the number one water quality issue, probably nationwide, is sediment. We've known about this forever. We just need to control erosion because we have too much topsoil in and up in the river, and that's our most fertile topsoil. That's where your herbicides are, everything that's attached to that soil particle once it leaves your field. All of that left with it. So again, like Eric said, this is not difficult to fix. We just need to keep the ground covered with living roots, and we can drastically reduce that soil erosion.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about kind of maybe from your unique perspective, Eric, too, about how these things actually work. What are the mechanics? How are a lot of the drinking water in the cities, how is that obtained? Is a lot of that surface water? Is a lot of that groundwater? Does it depend on where you're at in the country? How does that work generally in your understanding?
Well, it definitely depends on where you're at, but the vast amount of drinking water for individuals comes from surface water. And those are the ones that are the most easily affected by runoff. And Brian's right. Sediment is the number one, and everything's attached to it. Phosphorus, nitrogen, herbicides. And, fortunately, through the engineering type solutions, we do a very good job cleaning up drinking water, but it costs more and more all the time. It is always cheaper to have what I would call nature-based solutions, source water protection, keep it clean in the first place. But usually the world is built around bigger water plants or bigger levees if it's floods or anything else. And again, that's what the frustrating point is. If I want to, fix flooding issues, I just use the 6 principles. If I want to fix, water quality issues that come into the cities, I do it with the 6 principles. It is really that simple. But, you get out in again, like I said, the Ogallala area, so you've got nitrates. And so, the cities are having to not only to clean up, with reverse osmosis, some other things that are very expensive, but then there's the quantity issue where they're having to drill deeper wells, municipal wells, to meet the city. So unfortunately, it does create that us against them or city against country, or, and it doesn't have to be the case with the solutions. So again, engineered solutions, the way it works right now, but it's just so much cheaper to do it our way.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is if we had healthy soils that all adhered to or were impacted by the 6 principles, then those water quality issues that the cities are facing and the money they have to spend to clean it up would be greatly reduced.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example on this. One of the cities that has the cleanest drinking water probably in the world, but especially the United States, is New York City. And New York City controls its entire source water. So they bought the land, they control the lakes, they control everything that happens in their source water, and it's some of the cleanest water. Lake Tahoe area, again, very heavily controlled on how they do their source water. The water comes right out, it can go right into the system. So any time I get in areas that I have to clean it somehow or another, that's what the expense be. And it really doesn't matter whether I'm in Iowa or Nebraska or California. If I use the principles we're talking about, then the water becomes clean and it's cheap and it's easy and everybody's happier.
Can you put it in perspective what that cost actually is? Or like even from your past, do you remember what some of that cost associated with getting water ready to be fit for human consumption is?
It's hard for me to go down to an individual, but I got some great examples. I had worked a little bit in Springfield, Illinois, Decatur, Illinois, and the Decatur Lake there, and they had a $60 million dredging project, and my numbers may be off a little bit, and a $40 million upgrade to their water plant. So they were going to spend $100 million, and it was because of nitrates and its sediment that is filling in the lake. So you take a city like Decatur that's broken down into, say, let's 70,000 people. Well, that has to be absorbed by them. You go to Iowa. Des Moines, Iowa was spending $7,000 a day on a nitrate removal plant because of the water that was coming down to Des Moines and Raccoon River. So, $7,000 right then, that is extra that would not have to be used in that. So the individual is footing a lot of the bill on problems that could be easily fixed.
If those numbers are close, that's a $100 million project for Decatur, Illinois, with 70,000 people. The back of the envelope math says $1,428.57 a person.
Yes, and those type of things are happening all over. They really are. When you have a city out in Nebraska that's going to have to drill a new well to go deeper to get to water, well, that may be, $600,000-$700,000 to drill because it's different specs, it's different ways of doing it, drilling a municipal well, and those problems don't have to happen. So I know it's a touchy subject. I know we've kicked a hornet's nest here a little bit, as you said, but I think it's problems that need to be pointed out because they're easily solved. And I think it's a positive for us to be able to go into these areas and say, listen, we've got the solution here. Through education, through implementation of these 6 principles, we can theoretically save $100 million. And I know that sounds pretty crazy, but that absolutely can happen.
Yeah. And I've got a guy from Wisconsin and a guy from Missouri here today, so I just want to blow your mind that the city that's 40 miles west of me and 2 of my neighbors each of those three units, individuals, have wells that are 3,500 feet deep.
Wow. I can go 100 feet deep and have pristine water here in the Ozarks as much as I want. So yeah, puts it in perspective.
Yeah. So my personal well, I think, is 58 feet, or it's 60 feet deep. We pull from 58 or whatever it is. But the water is over 100 grains of hardness. My neighbor said, "I'm not sure how it bends to get out of the pipe." But so we use RO water, in our house for drinking. So I'm sympathetic to the cost of that. I've got a friend who put in a whole ranch RO system. I think the system itself was $30,000. And then the filters and the electricity to run it each were another $3,000 every year, and that's just for one ranch. Then you start thinking about cities of 50, 60, 100,000 people, and you can see the exponential increase of that kind of expenditure that it's going to take to make that happen, right?
Yeah. Like Eric said, the nature-based solutions are always going to be cheaper. And unfortunately, what we're starting to see is rather than go that route, some areas are actually taking that engineering approach that cities have traditionally done to clean up their water, and they're starting to apply that to ag ground with things like saturated buffers and bioreactors, trying to remove the nitrate before it gets to the river, which they work. But again, it's very expensive. It's treating a symptom rather than addressing the underlying cause of the problem. And it's just, we're never going to be able to engineer our way out of a water quality problem, in a large scale.
The fact that they're using a bioreactor makes me think that they actually understand the problem. It is a biological issue, right?
Exactly.
We had biology.
Yeah, and that's how they work. It's a biological process to remove the nitrate, but if we had the principles in place, we wouldn't be losing that nitrate to begin with. So
you'd have the biology in the soil that could fix the nitrogen out of the atmosphere, right?
Exactly. Yep.
One of the things that you said was that this can be done quickly, or it is possible on a reasonable time scale. And I think that's one of the things that, at least from my perspective and the way I think about these things is, these are insurmountable issues. And this is, affecting the water recharge rate of the aquifer is just beyond our ability to fix in our lifetime. So is that true? Is that correct in your understanding?
From a surface water standpoint, it can be fixed so quick. Like we said, you just keep the ground covered with a single species cereal during the winter in Iowa and stop that physical, erosion and things like that, and tie up a little nutrients. Surface water can be cleaned up very, very quick. Groundwater is going to take a little longer, because of the time of travel, nitrates, things like that. But the first thing is to stop it, and so nitrates based off wellheads and planting certain species or certain management around wellheads. I know Brian's dealt with this. You can clean it up fairly quick. Now, the phosphorus and legacy phosphorus and stuff like that, I think there's a lot of maybe questions of how quick that can be done or how it would be done. But the first thing is, let's just stop any more coming into first. And that's the first thing. And once you do that, nature is very resilient to be able to clean itself up. The soil is very resilient. And I think it can happen very, very quick. And I'm saying on surface water, 2 or 3 years. Easy.
Brian, do you have any perspective on the groundwater side of that, or?
Yeah, that's definitely going to take longer. I remember when I was a kid, so I grew up on a dairy farm, and this is 40 years ago. Our well was like 160 feet deep, and it was high nitrate 40 years ago. So this is a problem that's decades in the making. So we're not going to fix this overnight. And the only solution at that point is just drill deeper and find some water that's not high nitrate, because it hasn't gotten to that point yet. But you can only kick the can down the road for so many years doing that. So we have to fix the problem at the surface and prevent that nitrate from working down through our deeper groundwater to begin with. And it's entirely doable. Anecdotally, I've heard stories of people, that are testing their well every year, and they do a wellhead improvement project, and within several years, they're seeing some improvement already. So it can be done. It's going to be a bigger challenge, and it's going to take longer.
I think one of the things that helps put this in perspective too, though, is the length of time we've actually been using some of these industrial scale tools on our landscapes, for applying chemical fertilizers and those things too. It's not like we've been doing this for thousands of years necessarily. I mean, tillage, yeah, probably we could go back and find that a long time ago, but the industrial scale, though, it's been fairly recently. And so if we broke it fairly recently, maybe we can fix it a little bit faster than we think, in some cases.
Yeah, I have no doubt we can, just with the change in management, and even just the, without getting into the 6 principles, just the overuse of nitrogen to begin with, the time of application, when we're putting anhydrous down in the fall and letting it go all winter, I mean, there are, the reason we have dead zones, the reason we have problems we do is because of just poor use as well. So, split applications, there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could do besides having a living cover and a living root, just by managing what we're using conventionally.
Yeah. What else comes to mind on this water cycle, water quality, water management perspective?
For one thing that I notice, this is a world problem. This is really, there is not a place you can't go in the world that are not experiencing the same type of problems, floods, droughts, water shortages, things like that. And again, from a heavy rainfall environment, it's easy for me to say, but those type of problems all start with the soil. And what happens after that? Then we have famine, and we have unrest, and we have a lot of other, as you would say, compounding effects that come from that. And that's always what, to me, was cool about finding the understanding ag, the principles, is that it's like I felt like I found the basic solution to a lot of problems. And granted, water quality was just kind of the end I went in on. But as you look more, these are world problems, but the solutions are all the same.
Yep. Brian, anything else to add there?
Yeah, I think it comes back to education. We talk about that a lot at Understanding Ag, but once people understand how soil works and how aggregates form and all these, fairly simple things to understand, that, what you have to do to get your water to infiltrate, that can change everything. I'm going to pick on Eric a little bit here. I was driving through Missouri one day, and I was going by this farm, and it was just the perfect encapsulation of everything that's gone wrong and the engineering approach to trying to fix this. So I saw this farm, and it was, bare soil. There was erosion everywhere. There was gullies. And so they were out there putting in sediment basins, to catch the sediment before it left the farm. And they were tiling and taking the surface water away, just completely broken system. And at the very top of the hill, there's an irrigation pivot. So it's like they were creating all of their own problems, and they were spending all this money trying to fix them. So if we had more of the understanding of how that system works, just keep the ground covered, you wouldn't have to rely on that irrigation. You wouldn't have to rely on all that engineering to try to catch all of that sediment.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I appreciate the perspective, and I just think that is, we see that all over the place, right? We see we've talked about it a lot on this episode, different places where we're using engineering solutions, even biological solutions, after the fact to fix issues created by practices that are going against the principles. When we go against the 6 principles, then we're going to have to do more work chemically, mechanically, even engineered biological solutions. We're going to have to go back and try and fix those problems using all these other factors that cost more and more money every year to do, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we've seen just over and over. If we could just stop and hit the reset button a little bit and say, okay, why don't we just try something different here? But we're caught up in such the same solutions all the time. It's just hard it really is same stuff, different day, no matter where we travel. And it's the same reasonings behind it.
Yep. Very good. I appreciate you guys' time today. Eric, Brian, thank you for joining me again.
Thanks for having us, Clay.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Very good stuff there with Brian and Eric. Really appreciate them coming on to share their perspective. Very, very unique perspective with Eric and his time in rural source water protection there in Missouri and kind of understanding it at that level. And so I really appreciate that perspective that they brought. Looking forward to the next episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll be talking to Sean Smith. Sean is a dairy producer from Manitoba, and he is going to talk to us about how Canadian supply management and U.S. tariffs and all of those things are impacting him as a Canadian dairy producer. So looking forward to sharing that with you, coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.